I've stood in Auschwitz many times, and I've wept every time. Just the sheer overwhelmingness of it is inconceivable. It blows a fuse in your mind. And I've wept with many people who've told me that they're the only surviving relative. These are very deep and real things.
John Lennox is about to explain the problem of evil. How could an all-loving, powerful, omniscient God allow evil? He knows how to stop it, he would want to stop it, and he has the power to stop it. So why doesn't he? Let's go.
The reactions to suffering are very varied. You know, when the earthquake hit New Zealand, some of the reactions were fatalistic. That's God's will. God was behind it, he caused it, and so on. That fatalistic attitude that is characteristic of certain religions. But then there were other people that reacted and said, but these people suffer because of their karma. They must have done something in a previous life and now they're paying for it. And people who hold that view often say, well, there's no point in alleviating your suffering, because if I help you in your suffering, then that's going to make it worse for you in the next life because you've got to work off that suffering. Then the other view is, coming also from the Far East, is that suffering is an illusion, as the Buddha taught, caused by desire. So if we get rid of desire, we get rid of suffering. It's partly true, of course. Some of our suffering is caused by desire. And then others react, and they say, well, I can trust God in this. And many others say, don't be absurd. Isn't this finally the proof that there is no God whatsoever? Richard Dawkins, in his famous analysis statement, said, you know, this universe is just like you'd expect it to be. If at bottom there is no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music.
So according to Dawkins, we're all NPCs in a video game. But if we're all NPCs in a video game, who's complaining about the bugs in the game? Because NPCs can't do that. This is crazy.
So atheism is one of the increasingly common reactions here. Many of my friends, and I have many, many atheist friends around the world, they'll say to me, look, I look at the heavens, I look at the sheer wonders that science has shown to us, and maybe that is evidence that there's some kind of intelligence behind this universe. But don't you talk to me about a personal God. Isn't it obvious to you? Look at Auschwitz. Look at the Holodomor, hunger in Ukraine, where I've been very often. Look at this, look at that. Don't talk to me about a personal God who cares. You're insulting me. Now, I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, I have the deepest sympathy for people that become atheists for those reasons. I've stood in Auschwitz many times, and I've wept every time. Just the sheer overwhelmingness of it is inconceivable. It blows a fuse in your mind. And I've wept with many people who've told me that they're the only surviving relative. These are very deep and real things.
You see, this is where a lot of people like John Lennox, he starts with the human heart. He doesn't minimize pain to win debates, because most debates on this topic are cold and academic. Lennox, he acknowledges that suffering breaks people. So he starts from the human heart, and that's very powerful.
Now, try and follow me here. There's an intellectual side to this. If you imagine that atheism is a solution, let me suggest one or two things. I understand you if you're going in that direction. But yet I don't understand you in another direction. Certainly not if you take Richard Dawkins' view, because he tells me there's no good and no evil. But if that's so, why talk about the problem of evil if there's no good or no evil? If there is no God, I will want to know where you get the concept of good and evil from. Because if there's no objective, transcendent standard of values, our values are just subjective evaluations, just personal opinions, as many people today believe, under the influence of some kind of postmodern thinking. So where were you going to get evil from? So I will want to know that. Dostoevsky, again, once said, if God does not exist, everything is possible or permissible. Now, he didn't mean that atheists can't behave. That's an insult. My atheist friends could put me to shame morally. And from where I sit, the reason for that is very clear. That whether they believe in God or not, they're moral beings made in the image of God. So of course they can behave morally. That's not Dostoevsky's point. Dostoevsky's point is much deeper. He's saying there's no ultimate intellectual justification for good and evil if there is no God. And that needs to be thought through very carefully.
I mean, just look at Soviet Russia. Remove God officially, and Stalin ends up killing 20 million citizens because the state decides what's moral. No transcendent law means no limit on power.
Because it is a very important point. Charles Taylor, author of a brilliant book on this secular age, he writes this, the modern age has tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. Educated people do not need to be told. I'm afraid he's wrong there, they do need to be told. However, that questions such as these have never been answered outside of religion. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most powerful commentators on these things. I quote him, "When one gives up Christian belief, one therefore deprives oneself of the right to Christian morality. Christian morality is a command. Its origin is transcendental. It possesses truth only if God is truth." This is Nietzsche. It stands or falls with a belief in God. Now that's a very interesting thing. He connects morality with belief in God. Now, is there such a thing as absolute morality? I think there is, and I think we all deep down believe it. Is there anyone here who would say that under circumstances torturing babies is morally justifiable? If it isn't, you believe in something that's absolutely wrong. And J.L. Mackie was a famous atheist, notice, ethicist and philosopher at Oxford, and he pointed out that there's a very short step from the existence of absolute morality and belief in God.
So the Nuremberg trials would be a good example of this, because we didn't just say to the Nazis, that's just your opinion. We said that they absolutely violated human dignity. So there's this transcendent law that overrules human law.
But now the problems start to pour in. So let me look at some of the most difficult problems very quickly indeed. The first one is this. Surely God could have created us, if there is a God, without all this capacity for moral evil. If you're going to believe in a creator God, look, doesn't it make sense to believe in a sensible creator who doesn't make such a mess of it and produce people like me who are perfectly capable of doing evil and doing wrong? You might be surprised at my answer to that question. Of course he could. Of course he could. You can do it. You can create a robotic world where there's no morality at all. And there's no good and no evil. But, and here's the catch. God could create a world of robots and machines, but you wouldn't be in that world because you are a human being.
Wow.
And it's interesting, once we start to ask this question, if we're not careful, we find we're wishing ourselves out of existence.
Okay, I don't think there's a better place other than here to say, careful what you wish for. I mean, look at our movies, Braveheart, The Matrix, Star Wars. They all value freedom. William Wallace in Braveheart dies screaming freedom, and we cheer for it. Yet, when it comes to the problem of evil, we're basically saying, you know what, God? Just take away everyone's freedom. We don't realize we're asking to throw the very thing, our heroes died for.
Because you see, the most magnificent thing about you is that you, from my perspective, but it's always worth listening to a perspective. That's what the Veritas Forum is about, before you reject it. From my Christian perspective, the most magnificent thing about you is that you're made in the image of God, and you've got the capacity to say yes or no. You've got the capacity to love or to hate. Why would God risk making beings like that? Well, some of us here have children. I remember holding the first little girl. She was about this size, and I thought her head was about to fall off, as most parents do. Did you have that experience? Yeah. And I realized, look, you could grow up to reject me. You could grow up to perpetrate the most awful crimes. And yet I brought you into existence. Why take the risk, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we all know why. We think it's worth doing. We'd rather have a child than a robot.
Good point.
I've been married for 47 years, and I certainly wouldn't want a robotic wife to go home and press the iPad that's up here and says kiss, and you get a mechanical kiss. Would you be interested in that? Well, I don't think so.
I mean, robot marriage counseling would be interesting, though. Imagine the counselor telling you, have you tried turning on and off your relationship, though? Let's get back to the clip.
But seriously, we need to realize, and I think C.S. Lewis was dead right here. I found him so helpful in many things, that if you're going to have a world where love is possible, it must be a world where hate is possible. You cannot avoid that. And it's well worth reading Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, or Mere Christianity, or so on. Now, of course, that's moral evil. Natural evil doesn't come under that. Earthquakes and all this kind of thing. And the same question now comes. Couldn't God have created an earth where tectonic plates didn't collide? Now, when I landed in New Zealand, I was faced with this on television, on radio. In fact, if you're interested in a detailed discussion of this whole question, just Google my name in New Zealand, and there's a whole web page with all kinds of interviews on it. You think of tectonic plates. Now, here's the extraordinary thing. Quite by accident, I was reading, a week before I went to New Zealand, a book on tectonic plates. I like to keep informed about things. And the writers were arguing that the motion of tectonic plates is absolutely essential to having life on Earth. What? So here we have almost a paradox, isn't it? Because the tectonic plates shifted and many people died, and yet all of us would die if they didn't shift. It just pushes the question back. Couldn't God have made a world in which they shifted but nobody died? Could God not make fire that heated but didn't burn?
Isaiah 55 actually says that the Lord says, my ways are higher than your ways. So maybe tectonic plates are the perfect example of showing that, from our limited perspective, that we don't see the whole picture here.
These questions, have you ever been able to answer them? No. Do you know the kind of thing we do as students? I'm sure you do. We sit around coffee late at night, surely a good God would, could, should, all this kind of stuff. Have you ever got anywhere in
Nope.
that? I've never got anywhere. And I want to approach that question head on in just a moment or two. Why is it we never get a satisfactory answer to that question? I'll tell you why I think we don't. It's because when we've done all the discussion and all the arguing, reality faces us with two things: beauty and bombs, or beauty and barbed wire. We get a mixed picture from our experience of the world. We look at the heavens, magnificent. We look at the Grand Canyon. We look at the mountains, the Alps, magnificent. And then we look at malignant cancers. And we look at the evils of war. And the prison camps, and the gulag, and the children suffering, and the barbed wires. Beauty and barbed wire, you can't escape it. Isn't that so?
Romans 8 talks about creation groaning in labor pains. So even nature is caught between brokenness and beauty, waiting for redemption as well.
Now, I'm a mathematician. And one of the things about mathematics is this, that if you can't answer a question, you move on and try to ask a different one. I found that very helpful in life, but particularly on this question. We can't answer the question that David Hume put, surely a good God would, could, should, because we're faced with beauty and barbed wire when we've ended the discussion. So no answer that doesn't face that issue is going to help. How do we face this mixed picture? Well, I'm going to suggest that the question we can ask, and this is the one I do ask, is a very simple question. It's this: is there any evidence anywhere that there's a God that we could trust with it? That's a huge question, ladies and gentlemen. Let me repeat it. Is there any evidence anywhere that there's a God that we could trust with that mixed picture? And with the fact that most of us will die without having all our questions answered. That's my question.
Now that right here, guys, is the right question and the right shift. Lennox is moving from, instead of God, justify yourself, to God, can I trust you with this? Totally different conversation. So instead of putting God on trial, he's asking if God is qualified to be the judge.
I spent my life thinking about it. And I believe the answer to it is there is evidence. There is evidence. Now, this brings me back to what is specifically Christian, because I've looked at the other answers. I have friends who are engaged with all the other answers. I've read their stuff. And all I can share with you, because that's the whole point of a forum like this, you can invite other people to speak on other different worldviews, but this is where I find that Christianity helps me enormously, not to solve the problem, but to open a window into a possibility. And all I ask you to do is listen as I present very briefly what I understand the case is. And it's simply this, that At the heart of Christianity, there is a cross. You know that. Now just follow me for a moment. You may disagree with this, that's fine. But just follow me as I lay out the basic claim, the central claim of the Christian faith. It's an astonishing one. It's that there is a creator God who is not distant from us, but has actually visited our planet, has encoded himself in humanity, and he could do that because humanity is created in his image. That gives us infinite value, by the way. Humans are utterly special, as is seen by the fact that God could become one. Many people have never thought of that. That's the claim. It's an astounding claim. And as a scientist or as just an ordinary person, I want a lot of evidence for that to believe it's true. But just come with me. Suppose it is true. Suppose Jesus is precisely whom he claimed to be, God incarnate. Then the question is, what's God doing on a cross? Well, pretty obviously it tells us this, that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it.
God didn't stay distant. Listen to this quote from Dorothy Sayers. For whatever reason God chose to make man as he is, limited and suffering and subject to sorrows and death, he had the honesty and the courage to take his own medicine. Now that is what God did on the cross through Jesus.
That's the start. I could begin to trust a God like that. Now there's much more, of course, because if it had stayed there, we'd never have heard of Jesus. But the reason we've heard of him is that uniquely he rose from the dead, or rather, more precisely, he was raised from the dead by the power of God. And that changes the whole world for me, ladies and gentlemen. Because what it means is that in space, time, and history, there's been authentication of this claim. You can get at the evidence. I remember sitting in Cambridge as a student, listening to one of the most brilliant lawyers on the face of the planet as he gave a forensic analysis as a lawyer of the evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. And it was powerful stuff. I never forgot it. And it showed me, and I've spent a lot of time on it subsequently, and you can do that. It's all over the internet. And it's important that one does, because if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that is the end of Christianity, ladies and gentlemen. There's nothing left to salvage, because it means that Jesus was wrong in his central claim. That's a huge thing. It raises scientific questions. It raises all kinds of questions. And if you're interested in those questions, I've written a book called Gunning for God, where the last 2 chapters deal with the resurrection through the very skeptical eyes of David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher that I mentioned a few moments ago. But I'm going to come to the heart of this. You see, Richard Dawkins says there's no good, there's no evil, there's no justice. Does that mean that I'm to believe that those women and children that screamed their way into death in Auschwitz, there's no justice? Every human being I've ever met has a deep sense of the need for justice.
Yes.
You watch what happens in your mind if you're accused of doing something wrong. Wow, do you want to? And I want to. Get it clear. I didn't do it. And here's the evidence. We do want to be vindicated. Of course we do, because we're moral beings. Is there going to be justice? And when the early Christians, notably the Apostle Paul, went to Athens, to the philosophical court, the center of the intellectual world, the Areopagus, Paul stood up, and to those brilliant philosophers, he said, you know, there is going to be a judgment, ladies and gentlemen. There will be a final assessment. How do I know? Because the judge has already been appointed. God raised Jesus from the dead. Well, it was like a nuclear bomb hitting the place. But that's glorious, isn't it? You see, ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe that the people that caused 9/11 are going to get away with it forever. Atheism tells me they will. Now, when I raised this with Richard Dawkins, he said to me, but, you know, I work for justice in this world. I said, wonderful, Richard, so do I. But you don't believe there's any ultimate hope. There is no, by definition. And the multi-millions, if not billions of people who have lived on planet Earth and never had justice in this world will never get justice on the basis of atheism. I said, it's bleak. He said, yes, it's bleak. That doesn't mean it's false. That doesn't mean it's false. No, I said, but it doesn't mean it's true either.
I can't believe Dawkins just said, yes, it's bleak. Like, imagine that on an atheism recruitment poster. Join us. We promise you'll be disappointed.
We've got to get through this. Is there any evidence that there's a God we can trust with it? Now, if it's true, First of all, that God has participated in suffering. Secondly, that Jesus has broken the death barrier. Then maybe there's some truth in his claim that he is going to operate the final judgment. Of course, that leaves me with a problem. Where am I going to stand? Because I'm one of the goodies, aren't I? Oh no. If I compare my life with that of Jesus Christ, I'm one of the baddies, ladies and gentlemen. And this is the genius of it. That Christ claims that when he died, he was dying for me. For the guilt that I've incurred by the wrong things I know I've done. And this opens up the way in this life to freedom and the certainty of ultimate justice. These are huge, big things. It's big stuff. I know it's big stuff. And you may feel, what an odd thing for a professor at Oxford to talk about. But why? Oxford was founded on the basis and by people who believe this stuff. Our motto is Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord is my light. Most of our universities in the West originally were Christian foundations. Why? Because the Christians believed in engaging intellectually. It's an absolute nonsense that early Christians were people that didn't want to think. They outthought everybody else, and they gave us the universities. We've forgotten that so quickly, haven't we? So that's how I begin to approach these questions. And you need to decide what makes sense to you. Thank you very much.
You know what I like most about this discussion is that Lennox, instead of trying to explain and solve the problem of evil, he shifts to exposing how other worldviews fail in explaining the problem of evil. Like he showed how Eastern religions either like blame the victim or they call suffering an illusion. Atheism, you know, what is, suffering just exists. There's no ultimate justice, which is completely depressing. And there's that shift he made where instead of blaming God and demanding, answers for and details for each aspect of suffering in the world, he asked such a brilliant question, the one where, is there evidence that where we could trust God with this suffering? Now, that is, I could say, one of the best responses to the problem of evil, because instead of going into this infinite loop of demanding answers, we looked for evidence for, is God actually working in our world? And when we look at the cross, we read the Bible, and we look at the historical evidence for Jesus, that is enough for us to say, like, yes, I could trust God with my life because he's a suffering God. He's not a God who remained distant from us. He stepped into creation and he's suffering with us. Because look, we're all going to suffer one way or another. So your worldview better have an explanation for that suffering. And I think Christianity does a phenomenal job in doing that. So the cross doesn't solve every intellectual puzzle about suffering, but it does something far more important. It shows that God's plan A is not something that's from a distance, but rather that he's here with us.